My name's Katie, and I'm here to discuss the books that I read this last week. So, I only managed to read 2 books this week. It's a little lower than normal, but I had a lot of stuff going on, so I don't feel bad about it. I read 1 nonfiction and 1 fiction book. So, we'll do this in the order that I read them in. And there's only 2, so there's only 2 orders I can. Wow, the wind's strong today. There's only 2 orders I can do the list in anyways. So we're going to start with the first one. The first book that I read this week is Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience by Mihaly Czikszentmihalyi. I did look up how to say his name, so I really hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. So the reason I read Flow, or the reason I checked it out of the library, is because I saw this work being referenced in many other works that I was reading, which this actually goes back a couple of years. I began seeing his work being referenced in quite a number of things I've been reading over the last 3 to 4 years. And at a certain point, probably around the 5th or 6th time I saw it this year, which would be just in the books that I read in 2020, around the 5th or 6th time I realized I want to go see, and by see I mean read, what the original work says. So I did it. So this wasn't something I necessarily would have pulled off the shelf independently to read, but I did check it out because I did want to see what was the actual theory behind the reason it was being referenced all the time, if that makes sense. So I gave it a read. It was very quick to read, even though it's around 250 pages. I worried it was going to be very academic, but it read very easily, so I felt like I was able to absorb the ideas. However, it is the psychology of optimal experience, so there's a lot to digest here. So the one thing that I dislike about my reading experience is that I don't own this book. This was a library book, and I feel like this is a book that would be handy to have on hand to continually reference, or also to go back and read and make notes on the actual pages. So actually someone did this to the library book already. You can see someone wrote in the library book, that was not me, don't do this to your library books unless they purchased it used or something with the writing in it. But someone else obviously had the same thought process that I did, that making notes in the margins or underlining certain things would be helpful. So the premise, if I understand, we'll preface this with as I understand it. As I understand Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's theory of flow, theory of optimal experience, is that happiness can be found when we are in flow. And flow would be kind of the same thing that most of us would consider the zone. So most of us can actually relate to flow. This isn't actually something very mysterious. If anyone has ever been playing a sports game or really involved in a hobby or working on a problem and you lose track of time moves differently, you're completely focused on the task. What he refers to as your psychic energy is completely focused. It's not spread out among a variety of different things. It's focused on the task at hand. When you are in flow, that is when you are most happy. That is when you are having your optimal experience. So he builds, really in the first couple pages of this book, he builds out what his theory is, and then he goes on to give examples of people when they're in flow. He gives examples of how flow can be found even in very difficult circumstances, although he does admit there are situations in which optimal experience isn't one's top priority. For example, if you cannot eat every day, or if you do not have a safe place to live, then optimal experience isn't what is most important to you. But once you have your base needs covered, a lot of people, when they feel that lack, what they're next looking for is optimal experience. So he goes through, once he builds his theory, he goes through a lot of other things related to his theory, all the way to the end of the book where he tries to tackle the meaning of life. I'm not sure I'm completely convinced, but it's a pretty good try, and it's job well done. I couldn't write anything better than that. So it was a very interesting book. The one big takeaway, or the point that I thought that he made best, besides the theory of flow, so the theory of flow is obviously his work It's why I picked up the book. I felt like it was well explained. But he makes another point about 3/4 of the way through the book, talking about how many people do not spend their free time appropriately, or we tend to waste our free time in non-flow inducing activities, so many of us feel as though we aren't having optimal experiences in our free time. And he makes the point of television as being one of those things that doesn't really get us in the flow, or maybe the television was short attention span. He doesn't really like television in here. That is definitely something that he really discusses as something not very good. So the point stands, though. He did make comments about people not spending their free time appropriately. So while many people think they're unhappy at work, and they may very well be unhappy at work, they might be in flow more of the time at work because their entire psychic energy, as he calls it, is completely devoted to tasks at hand or challenges. So it's very thought-provoking. It makes, at least that was the most thought-provoking part for me, besides the actual theory, was just a reflection of how am I spending my free time? Am I structuring my free time towards optimal experiences? Do I spend my free time doing things that make me happy? Which more often than not, no, sometimes I do not. So this was a very good book. I believe I rated it 4 stars on Goodreads, and it's a 4-star book. It's very, very good. I recommend reading it, if only because of how often it is referenced in other books. So I think once you read this, you will start seeing it in other books or in other works or referenced in other works. Either way, it feels like it's a very good thing to know, to read about, to have at least been exposed to. So I'm really glad I read this, and I might be trying to get my hands on a copy of this book because I feel like it's just one of those things I'm going to want to reference again and again and again. And this being a library book, well, I'm very glad the library had it on hand for me to read. Isn't going to be very convenient for me to reference on the fly if I'm reading an article online and want to double check a citation or something in the book. So, Flow, that was my first book of the week. Very good, 4 stars. Highly recommend. The next one I read was fiction. So I finished. They put this plastic on here and it makes it very reflective. I know it's to protect the book, but it's still shiny. I finished Shorefall by Robert Jackson Bennet. So this one was about 500 pages, but the text was pretty big and it did read pretty quickly. This took about 2.5 devoted days of reading. So I did read it over like 4 or 5 days, but only 2 of those days were really spent in deep reading. So this would be about a 2-day read. I'd recommend 2 to 3 days. So this is the second book in the Founders trilogy. So I read the first book in the Founders trilogy, Foundry Side, a couple weeks back. And I really liked it. I gave it a 4-star, and I thought the world had been pretty built up. So I am going to talk about some things that either reference the first book or discuss plot points in the second book. So if you're looking forward to read it, maybe don't listen for the next couple minutes because I might spoil some stuff for you. So the first thing I actually want to talk about is this is the second book I've read this year that has a struggle from book 1 to book 2, and I'll talk about what I mean by that. So sometimes I find when reading a series, or particularly a trilogy, when going from book 1 to book 2, an author will not know how to, and this is my perception, I should say that, they won't, there's almost a pacing problem. It feels very awkward starting book 2, and I feel like part of that is how do I imply time has passed, how do I fill the reader in on what has happened with the time that has passed, and how do I just begin the second book kind of like in the middle of action, but also I need to catch the reader up. So I understand this is a problem. You need to begin the book, you don't just want to boringly tell your reader what happened in the time between the first book and the second book, but you also, like, you don't want to just tell them, but you also have to begin an action, and then you have to kind of fill in the reader, but you don't want to spend too much time filling in the reader, you want it to feel natural, and I feel like it can be kind of clunky. So, which doesn't doesn't detract from my overall experience. It's typically just the first page or two where I find this, but I found this in this book. I found that problem in this book. The other book that occurred in was the, I'm going to say this the best I can, the Devabad trilogy by, I believe it was S.A. Chakrabarty, from City of Brass to Kingdom of Copper. If I got those titles correctly. The first and second book in that series, I felt like the beginning of the second book was particularly weak in that they tried to do it immediately after the first book to try to catch you up with everything that happened, and then now we're going to skip ahead 3 years in like chapter 1 or a few pages later. But now you know what happened right after the first book ended. And I just felt like it was clunky. It got the point across, it got me caught up, but I felt like they could have cut that out. In this book, they didn't pick up right after Foundry Side ended. They pick up, I believe, 3 years later, a couple years later at least. And they do fill you in, but it feels a little clunky. Again, that's just immediately I went to that other series I read where this time they didn't try to start you right afterwards, but it still felt clunky. And some trilogies don't have this problem, so maybe I should start paying attention to what trilogies don't have this problem and see what they're doing that other trilogies aren't. Again, I'm not an author, so I don't know how to fix this problem. I just call out the problem when I see it, or when I perceive it to be a problem. So, read this book. This book takes place, like I said, right after Foundry Side, or 3 years after Foundry Side, and it follows the same cast of characters. We have our protagonist. She's now teamed up with some people, and they're trying to stop the return of someone who shouldn't be coming back with the help of another powerful being who's acting a little shady. So together they have to stop the bad guy from coming back. I will say that the twist that I thought was going to be the end of this book actually happened in the first couple chapters. Ta-da! The bad guy came back. I feel like most people will be able to see that coming. So then it's just outwitting him, trying to think about what he's doing and what they need to be doing to counteract what he's doing, working with this other being, Valeria, I believe is her name. So she's this construct that this team of our protagonists are working with to try to stop the big bad guy from coming back. And she's acting a little shady. We don't really know what she's up to. We don't really trust everything she's doing throughout the book. So this just follows their adventures trying to stop him. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 4-star. It did the job. It followed on what was built in book 1. It gave us plenty of action, plenty of new, fresh, exciting stuff. I didn't feel like it was just a repeat of the first one. I will say there was a couple of plot points that felt a little convenient, especially towards the end of this book, concerning Gregor's mother, Ophelia Dendalo. I felt like her switch, her change, some decisions she made at the end, well, not out of character for her, was just convenient for the main characters, but sometimes you have to have convenient things happen. So that was just something I noted, but it wasn't necessarily bad. It was just very convenient. So that would be one little thing to note. The other thing I would say is that there is a romance, which kind of begins in book 1, which continues in this one, but I personally did not feel any chemistry between the two characters. I felt more chemistry among the group of friends, just working as one, which at the beginning I was a little annoyed because I felt like their conversations between the two people who were in a relationship were falling kind of flat. But then I realized that I could live without the romance being real and imaginative, and it was kind of refreshing to not have the romance or the relationship be a center of the book. It just existed, it just was. They've been together for 3 years, so it's not new and exciting anymore necessarily, and it was kind of refreshing, I have to say. I actually wound up liking it closer to the end, that the focus was more on the relationship between the friends and the other members of the group, and less about these two women and their relationship with each other, and just a focus on romance that sometimes I feel like fantasy books have, where if there's a romance between two people, well, that's the one relationship we're going to be delving into, which can have its time and place, but when the book kind of twists things, it was a little refreshing. So that was a very well done thing that at first I thought I wasn't going to like, but then I wound up liking. So again, 4 stars. I felt like the end of this book set up what's going to happen in the third book very nicely. I was wondering what they were going to do because the bad guy in this book was kind of set up to be the big bad guy, but obviously there's twists, things change, and I was worried going into this book when I started reading it that they were pulling out their big bad guy in this book. Like, what were they going to do for book 3? I thought, well, maybe they won't defeat him, and I'm not going to tell you what winds up happening with this big bad guy, but ultimately there's plenty of stuff left for book 3. I'm excited to see where this goes, and I will have to look at when this came out. I believe this is a new release, so we probably won't be getting the third one in the trilogy for quite a while, but when it does come out, and when my library receives it, I will definitely be placing a hold, and I want to see what gotta get his name right, Robert Jackson Bennet does with the end of this series. So I'm very excited about this and look forward to reading the third part of this trilogy. So these two, oops, only ones I read this week, but I feel pretty good. Plenty of pages, plenty of content. I'm really, really happy I got through this. This has been on my to-read for quite a while, and I'm very glad that I got this done. And this was just a fun way to spend a couple days this weekend, and was a great read. So 2 4-star reads, very good week, nothing to complain about. This coming week, I hope to read a little bit more nonfiction, and I do anticipate reading and finishing quite a number more books than just 2. We'll see what happens. Obviously, things can change. So if anyone has any thoughts on the books that I read this week or suggestions, feel free to let me know. I always like to hear about books, and I always like to talk about books. Otherwise, have a great day, everybody.